Okay, so my name is Briana Neale. This is my post-test assignment for Social Work 542, Trauma and Human Rights. I'm just gonna get right into it. I'm gonna start with my post-test responses and reflect on what I originally thought all the ideas and concepts we were learning about were, and then what I've learned and how those ideas have changed. I'm gonna head start with the definitions. So some of the general ones like human rights. On my pretest, I talked about them in a really general sense, like the rights that people have and deserve, regardless of their nationality, origin, things like that. But since taking the class and actually studying it, I've really learned that there's levels to the generations of human rights, like categories. Um, some of the things like the natural rights, the first generation rights, second generation rights, and how those differ from each other, and then how those are manifested. And I've also learned more about how there's rights versus needs and wants, and even luxuries, and what those can be. Another subject of trauma, I originally talked about how it was formed by any situation that happens to anyone depending on how it affects them. So kind of sort of speaks to what the definition of trauma is, but not as concrete as the definition that I have now. Mainly that the trauma is an experience that overwhelms your ability to cope. And that's really the understanding that I always look back to now when I'm thinking about trauma, as well as the idea that it's not what's wrong with you, but what's happened to you. And that's really informed my thinking just about how people can respond to trauma differently because it's not just the event that's traumatizing, it's your ability to cope or not cope that makes it traumatizing um, to each individual person. And that's really what I've understood after taking this class. The next topic being trauma informed care versus trauma specific treatment. Originally, I had just, kind of said they both involve trauma. One's about treatment and one's about general care. But now I've really learned how the trauma informed care is all encompassing and it really focuses on whether those principles are being met or not. So, the safety piece, the trustworthy piece, the culture and the social abilities, and how that's being used in the setting where the trauma informed care is happening in every aspect, and the pros and cons of that. Being the trauma informed care, and then the trauma treatment being just a specific thing that's being done, and it's been researched that this works for clients who have been through trauma in this one specific setting, not the type of thing where you walk into an agency and everyone you speak to is trauma informed and everything you look at is trauma informed. Being the difference between trauma informed care and trauma treatment. The next thing on our pre-test was countertransference. I had wrote when one situation is affected by another. Now I've learned the specifics of those situations and how they affect others, being how your feelings as the therapist can arise in a response to a specific client. I've learned that countertransference is something that always occurs, and that it's something that you can and you can't ignore. So you shouldn't ignore it because you should be actively working around that countertransference in order to do the best thing you can for the client. But you shouldn't make that the whole subject or the whole surrounding reason of how you work with that client. So it's something you have to identify and work to get over so that you can still help that client when that countertransference occurs. Next would be the re-traumatization versus secondary traumatic stress versus vicarious trauma versus burnout. So the differences in those terms. On the pretest, I talked about how, in general, how lasting trauma affects people in different ways, not knowing the differences between those sort of things. But now I know more specifically how re-traumatization is something that happens in response to a single event when you've had a trauma before, versus, vicarious trauma when this might happen in response to a client or others instead of the response to a single event. Um, Another difference being that the burnout is something that's agency or organizational that happens over time. And this can be to any sort of thing that you do, not necessarily a specific type of work or a specific area of work. It's just being overwhelmed with the amount of things that you have to accomplish. And you don't need trauma in order to experience burnout. And then finally, the differences in secondary traumatic stress being that something new has happened and then those old feelings are activated. And that this can also happen to a single event, but you don't have to have a trauma history in order to experience this, and it doesn't have to happen to you in order to experience. So now I really understand the differences between those different terms and how they're manifested in a person. Some other things from the pretest being the resilience versus stress-related growth and post-traumatic growth, which are some other terms that I really feel like I've grown in learning, especially through writing those assessment papers and the self-care papers. So just to define my new understanding of resilience being when anyone, being an individual, community member, an agency, anything like that, is able to use the resources that they have around them to conquer what they have experienced in their lives, those hard things, versus the post-traumatic growth, which is when someone has a positive change and that they've experienced after an event that was traumatizing. So really taking something good and building a new skill out of something horrible that's happened to them, being post-traumatic growth. The next one I'll go over is H, so one of the final ones, which is discussing self-care. So on the pretest, I wrote that self-care is being able to identify what helps you maintain a healthy lifestyle and make time to practice this as something that allows you to continue work. And it's pretty similar, my understanding of self-care now, but I'd say since going through the semester, I just now better understand what is best for myself and my personal self-care, and doing the self-care plan and the self-care paper really helped me realize those specific things that work for me. Then finally, I just wanted to discuss the ratings that we did at the end of the pretest. I had originally said that my understanding on a scale of 1 to 100 for trauma would be a 60, trauma-informed care being a 40 to 50, and human rights being a 50. Those have definitely really increased since taking this class. My new understanding of a trauma level, I would bump right up to an 85. I would say trauma-informed care is at an 80 and human rights another at an 85. And this is just because I do feel that I've learned a lot, but there's always going to be more to learn. There's going to be more to practice. And I mean, in the field of research, there's going to be more that's figured out, and then there will be more to learn too. So not only learning from the research, but learning from myself once I'll start practicing is the growth that I can see continuing from those 80s and 85s. So as part of the next part of the assignment, I'm going to discuss 3 things that I feel I've learned throughout the semester, 3 specific things. The first specific thing I feel like I've really learned a lot about is the various forms of trauma. So the ones that I had discussed earlier, like the vicarious trauma, the secondary trauma, burnout, and the differences between those. That's not anything that I knew about before. I mean, coming into this program, I knew trauma was a big thing, and I'm going to learn about trauma. I'm going to take a class on trauma, but I didn't know that it was going to be broken down into different types of trauma and different ways it can be experienced, whether firsthand, secondhand, re-traumatization, things like that. So I really learned how to break down the aspects of trauma and how people experience it. Another thing that I learned in this class would be more about trauma-informed treatment specifically. So, like I said, I had a general idea before, but now I really understand the principles, which are the main elements, such as the safety, the trust, the cultural factors, and the historical factors, and how those are really manifested in agencies in order to be an all-encompassed trauma-informed agency. So doing the agency assessment really helped me realize what are the ways that places can show safety through their waiting room and their language, or what are the ways that people can show the trust through the practice. Doing that for my own agency and then hearing about others was really helpful to see how it's actually used in practice. Then the third thing that I really feel like I learned is about human rights according to different generations, those categories. And that I also mentioned before. So learning about civil rights and political human rights and natural and social and cultural and community. Those are things that I didn't realize that human rights were categorized into before. My understanding was just there's human rights and everyone deserves them, but not everyone gets them. So breaking it down was helpful to me in the class to understand really what those human rights are and how they're jeopardized for people who are vulnerable and how that affects them. So then for the third part of the assignment, I'm just going to discuss how I think the course informed my social work development in general. I definitely think that I became more aware and knowledgeable about many at-risk populations thanks to those forums that we did. So things like the LGBTQ population and the refugee population, the people who might be, you know, re-entering the U.S. after incarceration. Those are all populations that when we read stories about them and responded to TED Talks about them in the forums, I got a lot more detailed knowledge on, not only about the population, but how they're vulnerable and how their rights can be jeopardized and how they could be influenced in a positive way by using trauma-informed care and practice in specific to each population. So I really enjoyed that part. So I think that that's going to inform my development by being more knowledgeable about those different populations. Another thing would be having factual knowledge on human rights. For example, having a document that lists all the human rights is not something I had really looked at before. Now I have that in my toolbox to look back on. So that's definitely going to help me in the future by having something concrete to take a look at. And then finally, just having an understanding and an ability to use trauma-informed care in practice, and also share that with others. So as we know that it's necessary to share how to be trauma-informed with others, not everyone's aware of it. So I think that it's necessary to have the ability to share this, not only in the social work setting, but in other settings as well, meaning my personal life or a setting I might work in that's not necessarily social work. So I'm glad that I have this knowledge that I can share now. So that is the end of my post test. Again, it's Briana Neale for social work, 542 Trauma and Human Rights. Thank you.